turn on notifications and never miss the beginning of a new story again. Join us and be part of every chapter. The abyss of iniquity had never been so beautifully adorned as in the twin cities that lay on the edge of the fertile plains of the Jordan. Sodom and Gomorrah, names that time would whisper with trembling, stood as monuments to opulence and unbridled pride, ignoring the invisible plumb line that governed the heavens. Beneath a cloak of deceptive prosperity, their people wove a web of cruelty and hedonism, where the cry of the poor was silenced by the clamor of banquets, and justice had become a mirage, lost in the thick fog of boundless pleasure. The Eternal, whose patience is an ocean, but whose holiness is a consuming fire, observed the earth from a point where time bent, and his gaze, heavier than mountains, fixed upon the valley, revealing the rot that spread like a spiritual leprosy. The ordeal, invisible at first, was already foreshadowed not by what the cities suffered, but by what they caused to suffer, and the stage was set for the most solemn of judgments. Amidst that seething decay lived Lot, Abraham's nephew, whose soul, like a lit candle in the midst of a storm, struggled not to be extinguished by the icy wind of surrounding impiety. He had chosen the fertility of those lands, seeking material abundance, and now he paid the price of proximity to the abyss, watching corruption seduce his own descendants and threaten the moral foundation of his home. Lot's suffering was not physical, but spiritual. It was the excruciating pain of a righteous man forced to coexist with evil, to witness injustice disguised as law, and to see the absence of God celebrated as freedom. His solitude was profound, for he was a moral stranger in his own home, a man who prayed silently while the city screamed blasphemies, and his heart carried the weight of wavering hope, of the desire to protect what remained of his family from imminent decay. The malice of the Sodomites was not merely a deviation from proper conduct, but an active choice, a delight in perversity that defied the very firmament. Their laughter was hollow, their feasts rituals of self-worship, and their hearts cold stones, incapable of feeling the pain of others or the fear of the unseen. They believed themselves invulnerable, protected by their wealth and the strength of their walls, mocking any notion of morality or higher judgment. The eternal narrator saw the motivation of each soul, the pride that blinded the leaders, the insensitivity that paralyzed the people, and the skepticism that made them laugh at omens, like the scorching wind that blew without explanation or the unsettling pulse of the stars at twilight. For them, these were mere natural phenomena, not the harbinger of the holy wrath that was already stirring, driven by the clamor of innocent victims whose tears had reached the throne. Then the celestial murmur, previously almost inaudible, became a silent thunder that only angels and the righteous could discern. On a day that seemed like any other, destiny, intertwined with history, and two celestial messengers disguised as travelers descended to the city gate, bearing not visible swords, but the ultimate scales of judgment. Their arrival was the final test, the straw that broke the camel's back in the cup of iniquity, and Lot, acting on an impulse of faith and hospitality that the city had forgotten, hastened to receive them into his home, unknowingly fulfilling an ancient commandment. His simple and courageous obedience contrasted sharply with the hysterical and violent reaction of the mob that, drawn by malice, surrounded the house, demanding the guests for vile purposes. The siege that night was, in fact, the siege of destiny, and Lot's ordeal reached its most critical point, the moment when faith would be the only bulwark against the fury of the human abyss. The mob's fury was a spectacle of depravity, a sea of faces contorted by vile desire, illuminated only by the flickering torch of lust and hatred against the stranger. Lot, in a desperate act, placed his frail body as a shield between the city's fury and the sanctity of his guests, offering what was most precious to him in a sacrifice of protection that revealed the depth of his despair and the purity of his faith. He saw not angels but men under his protection. He saw not judgment but the imminence of violence that violated the sacred code of hospitality. The narrator, with omniscient vision, saw Lot's heart pounding with terror, but also with resolute obedience to the unwritten law of the desert, the one that honors the guest above himself. The scene was a microcosm of cosmic conflict, innocence besieged by barbarity, faith tested by the fire of affront, and divine design about to be revealed in an explosion of power that humanity could never conceive. The attempted break-in, the creaking of the wooden planks under the brute force of the crowd, was the sound of the thin line separating mercy from judgment being broken. In that instant of humiliation and extreme danger, the nature of the visitors was revealed. The touch of their hands, no longer human, struck Lot, pulling him inside and closing the door with an authority that silenced the chaos. The city was then struck by a sudden and supernatural blindness, a veil of darkness that was not only physical but spiritual, forcing those who considered themselves masters of the light to grope in despair. The frustration of the mob, now struggling against the invisible door, transformed into a roar of perplexity and panic, the first sign that they had challenged something far greater than a mere inhabitant. The Eternal, through his emissaries, was beginning to move the pieces of destiny, and the time of grace was coming to an end, giving way to the manifestation of justice. In the safety of the house, the angels revealed the purpose of their visit. They were not mere travelers, but the executors of the irrevocable sentence. The revelation of the divine purpose fell upon Lot like thunder, mixing relief and terror. The messengers' voices were solemn, bearing a covenant of protection amidst destruction. The cry of these cities has risen to the Eternal, and he has sent us to destroy them, echoed the sentence. Lot, the man tormented by living with evil, was now the recipient of ultimate mercy, the escape route on a map of condemnation. His faith, once a dying ember, was rekindled as he realized that his obedience in hospitality, his small act of justice, had been noticed and rewarded by the Almighty. The ordeal of living in Sodom was ending, but a new and more urgent one was beginning, the test of escape and detachment. Time was running out. Night was advancing, and the invisible smoke of judgment already hung over the rooftops. The plan was clear. Lot should gather his wife and daughters and all those who belonged to his household and flee without delay before the sun kissed the horizon. From that moment on, Lot's mission was that of a herald of salvation. Amidst condemnation, but his voice met with scorn. His sons-in-law, immersed in the illusion of Sodom's invulnerability and the arrogance of skepticism, laughed at the warning, mistaking it for the ravings of a frightened man. They had drunk too much from the city's cup to believe in the existence of a higher power or the imminence of catastrophe. The narrator reveals the brutal contrast: Lot's faith, now fortified by angelic presence, against the stubborn blindness of those who preferred ruin, to redemption. That mocking laugh would be the last sound of his condemnation, an echo of arrogance that the fire would soon silence. The sun still slept beyond the mountains, but the light that was to come would bring not the dawn, but the fire of judgment. Lot's heart was torn between the urgency of flight and the natural hesitation of one who abandons everything. He lingered, perhaps glancing one last time at his accumulated possessions, or still cherishing the vain hope that his sons-in-law would change their minds. The mercy of the Eternal, however, did not wait for human indecision, and the patience of the celestial messengers had its limits. It was then that, in an act of protection and compassionate coercion, the angels took Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters by the hand, pulling them out of the city. That touch, firm and supernatural, was the materialization of the covenant, the direct intervention that snatched the righteous from the trap of their own slowness. The humiliation of forced flight became the first step towards redemption, a lesson that, in the face of judgment, salvation demands absolute detachment. The final commandment, uttered with the solemnity of an eternal decree, resounded in the ears of Lot and his family as their feet touched the dust of the road. Flee for your life, do not look back, nor stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, lest you perish. The order was a profound metaphor. Salvation demanded a fixed gaze toward the future, a total repudiation of the corrupt past. Looking back would not only be an act of disobedience, but a secret desire to retain the memory, the longing, or even the pleasures of the life that would be consumed. The narrator reveals the silent tension in the soul of each of the fugitives. Lot focused on obedience, his daughters between fear and confusion, and his wife, whose heart, bound by invisible threads of affection to her possessions and her former life of comfort, hesitated to completely break free. The fate of each would be sealed by the direction of their gaze. As they hurried toward the small town of Zor, obtained at Lot's beckoning, as a closer refuge than the mountain, the sun finally broke through the darkness, but not with the gentle light of a new day, but with a blood-red glow heralding the catastrophe. The sight unfolding over the valley was one of terror and majesty. Fire and brimstone, like an inverted burning rain, began to fall from the sky, not as drops, but as incandescent torrents, a deluge of flames that consumed everything it touched. The once fertile landscape was transformed into a liquid hell, and the cries of the city, once of mockery, were now of agony and despair, rising as a final lament before being drowned out by the fury of the fire. Divine justice manifested itself vividly and undeniably, and the Eternal, who is slow to anger, showed his holiness against sin. It was in this moment of triumph of faith amidst destruction that the weight of the forbidden choice fell upon Lot's wife. Her heart was not in flight, but in remembrance. Her gaze was not on Zor, but on the smoke rising from her destroyed home and lost possessions. Longing, attachment, the lack of final detachment, acted like an irresistible magnet. She turned her head. In that millisecond of disobedience, a white lightning bolt, sharp as the sword of condemnation, struck her. The transformation was instantaneous and terrible. She did not die, but was crystallized, transformed into a pillar of salt, a frigid and eternal monument to hesitation. The narrator reveals the profound meaning. Salt, an element of covenant and preservation, became a symbol of sterility and judgment, immortalizing the soul that preferred the corrupt past to the future of redemption, a silent testament to the price of looking back. Lot and his daughters dared not stop, but the dry sound of transformation, the muffled cry that was not of pain, but of petrification, was etched into their souls. The father, driven by terror and obedience, continued to run without even daring to look back, accepting the inevitable sacrifice of his wife as part of the price of salvation. His faith, tested to the utmost, did not waver at the crucial moment, focusing on the promised refuge, on the covenant that protected him. The pain of loss was immense, but the majesty of divine intervention, the falling fire, and the rising pillar of salt imposed a paralyzing reverence. Lot's triumph over the ordeal of Sodom did not come with joy, but with the solemnity of one who escapes by a thread, understanding that the life given to him was an undeserved gift and a legacy of obedience. The hours of judgment passed, and little Zoar, spared by temporary mercy, became the stage for reflection and mourning. Lot, the saved patriarch, climbed the mountain, seeking solitude and utter safety, a final act of detachment from the condemned valley. From there, he looked back, and the sight was one of overwhelming desolation. Where once cities of marble and lush gardens flourished, now lay a sea of black smoke, rising to the sky like the incense of eternal damnation. The landscape was unrecognizable, covered in ash and sulfur, a vivid and contrasting testament to the destructive power of holy wrath. The before and after were a silent cry. Opulence and arrogance had been transformed into a smoking desert, and the triumph of faith manifested itself in mere survival in the face of such annihilation. Lot felt divine justice as a weight on his soul. The indignation at the injustice that had surrounded him for years was now appeased by the bitter satisfaction of redemption. He saw the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, his uncle, who had interceded for the cities, seeking 10 righteous men who could save them. The absence of these 10 righteous men was the final proof that evil had triumphed in Sodom, and destruction was therefore an inevitable fulfillment. His own salvation was the manifestation of God's faithfulness to the covenant with Abraham, to whom the Eternal had promised to protect his descendants. Lot's fate was not a matter of chance, but a design woven into the tapestry of promise, and he was the only survivor of the valley to carry the prophetic legacy of judgment. High on the mountain, far from the smoke and echoes of destruction, Lot began a new ordeal, that of seclusion and reconstruction. That place, once a refuge, became a cloister of fear and despair for his daughters. The absence of other men and the vision of the catastrophe that had annihilated the world they knew led them to make a drastic decision, guided more by the panic of extinction and the desolation of grief than by faith in a future provided by the Eternal. The narrator reveals human fragility in the face of trauma, the loss of their mother, the end of the known world, and the ancestral need to preserve their lineage led them to an act of despair that, although reprehensible, was a product of the apocalyptic atmosphere surrounding them. The legacy of Lot, the righteous one saved, would be tainted by an era born of fear and solitude on the mountain, showing that the redemption of the soul does not always guarantee the complete purity of posterity. The decision of Lot's daughters, driven by the anguish of infertility and the terror of loneliness, was a grim reflection of the influence of the valley they had left behind, a stain on the purity of their escape. They feared that their father's lineage would be extinguished, seeing themselves as the last survivors of a world in flames, and the promise of posterity seemed uncertain in the desolate vastness of the mountain. The narrator, with a vision that transcends human morality, reveals that their despair was profound, an echo of a survival mentality that ignored the higher design. In that seclusion, far from civilization and law, they conceived a plan that, while guaranteeing offspring, would seal the fate of their future children as nations born of transgression, showing that even divine triumph over evil can have complex and painful consequences in the human sphere. Years passed, and from the union born of desperation and manipulation, two sons emerged, Moab and Ben-Ammi, the fathers of the Moabite and Ammonite nations. The legacy of Lot, the man who escaped the fire, would not be a simple story of purity and righteousness, but a chronicle of complexity, where divine intervention mingled with human fallibility. The Eternal, in his timeless justice, allowed these nations to develop, but their origin, marked by the shadow of need and error, would influence their history with Israel. Lot's triumph, the salvation of his life, was complete, but his family's legacy would be a perennial reminder that total obedience is a heavy burden, and that the scars of trial can shape the future in unexpected ways, requiring faith to be constantly renewed and transmitted. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, as told from that point on, was not merely a tale of punishment, but an epic tale of redemption and warning. The contrast between the smoking plain and Lot's mountain was the most eloquent sermon. On one side, the iniquity that calls forth fire. On the other, faith, however imperfect, that finds refuge. The pillar of salt, seen from afar, was the focal point of the tragedy and the unfulfilled commandment, a silent memorial to the soul that could not free itself from the past. The narrator elevates the moral of the story, emphasizing that spiritual transformation is not only escaping destruction, but renouncing the desire to look back, to cling to what was justly condemned. Lot, by accepting loss and isolation, fulfilled the most difficult part of his ordeal, the acceptance of the higher will, even if it came wrapped in pain and desolation. If you're enjoying this story, take a second. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's continue with this exciting adventure. The fate of Lot, the patriarch who saw the world consumed and was saved by the hand of angels, thus became a beacon of warning and inspiration. He did not become a great prophet or a war hero, but a living testament to justice and mercy. His triumph was not in conquest, but in flight, in the ultimate obedience that guaranteed his life. The contrast between his life in Sodom, tormented by injustice, and his life on the mountain, marked by seclusion and fear, was proof of spiritual transformation, the search for refuge, and the acceptance of a simpler life, more reverent to God, far from opulence and corruption. The epic of Lot taught that faithfulness, even amidst imperfection, is the only path to salvation when judgment manifests itself, and that divine intervention, though frightening, is the greatest proof of the covenant and protection. The memory of that night, the sound of the falling fire, the muffled cries, and the sight of his petrified wife never left Lot. In the quiet of the mountain, he pondered the immeasurable power he had witnessed, and reverence mingled with terror in his soul. He understood that salvation was not a reward for merit, but an act of grace, a design that bound him to the promise made to Abraham. From then on, his life was a living chronicle of God's faithfulness, a man who, despite his mistakes in choosing a dwelling place, was redeemed because of the greater covenant. This realization was the true spiritual transformation, the recognition that divine justice operates with a rigor that punishes iniquity, but with a mercy that extends to the righteous, even when surrounded by evil. Lot's legacy, though stained by his daughter's desperate act, carried with it a silent prophecy. The nations born from him, Moab and Ammon, would be neighboring peoples of Israel, nations that would sometimes be instruments of trial and, at other times, of alliance. His existence was proof that human history is an entanglement of choices and consequences, where the judgment of one generation is reflected in the destiny of the next. The narrator reveals that the Eternal, in his sovereignty, weaves the threads of history from all events, transforming even the error born of fragility into part of the grand plan. Lot's triumph, therefore, was not the end of a story, but the birth of a new saga, marked by the need for constant vigilance and the remembrance of fire. The smoke rising from the valley, visible for ages, was more than a sign of destruction. It was the materialization of divine indignation against injustice. For the caravans passing in the distance, the salt sea, which covered the site of those cities, was a geographical reminder of the condemnation. The very nature of the place was transformed, reflecting the spiritual necrosis that had taken hold there. Divine justice was not just a concept, it was a landscape, a smell, a silence. Lot, in telling his story, did not speak of personal glory, but of the majesty of the power that descends from the heavens to balance the moral scales of the world, elevating the morality of the story to a level of awe and reverence. Thus, the chronicle of the escape from Sodom has been perpetuated as an epic tale of redemption and faithfulness. The contrast between Lot's life in Sodom, where he was a rich but tormented man, and his life after judgment, where he was a humble and fearful survivor, illustrated true transformation. He exchanged opulence and constant moral trial for simplicity and peace of conscience. The triumph was not the recovery of lost possessions, but the salvation of the soul and the recognition of God's power. The story concluded with the solemn satisfaction that faith, even when it wavers, when confronted with disobedience and loss, is the only anchor that holds man amidst the storm of judgment, fulfilling the promise that the righteous will not be abandoned. Lot's life in the mountains was a perpetual act of silent worship, an offering of gratitude that transcended grief and pain. With each sunrise, he saw the mountains, no longer as a barrier, but as a sanctuary, separating him from the curse of the valley. His transformation was evident in his new priority, the spiritual safety of his daughters and the preservation of the memory of divine intervention. He became a chronicler of the catastrophe, a guardian of the truth about what pride and lack of compassion can bring about. The narrator emphasizes that Lot, once a businessman focused on the wealth of the valley, was now a man of faith, focused on transcendence and higher law, showing the depth of the change wrought by the ordeal. The shock and remorse of the Sodomites, manifested in cries of agony as the fire fell, came too late. The skepticism that had made them laugh at Lot's warning transformed into panic and recognition of the divinity they had defied. That final moment of terror, where pride crumbled under the weight of sulfur, was the consummation of justice. The omniscient narrator saw malice dissolve into despair and the certainty of condemnation strike every soul that had rejoiced in injustice. The victory of Lot's faith was the direct contrast to their ruin, and the final triumph was proof that God's covenant with the righteous is the only unshakable truth in a transient world. For years, the Pillar of Salt stood as a macabre beacon, a natural sculpture that told the story of disobedience and attachment. It was the antithesis of Lot's triumph, a symbol that salvation demands total detachment. Lot's daughters, looking down into the valley, saw their mother's monument and felt the weight of the forbidden choice, which increased their fear of having no future. The narrator reveals that the pillar's presence was a continuous trial for the family, a reminder that the line between redemption and damnation is thin and requires constant vigilance of the soul to avoid succumbing to longing for what was rightfully lost. The story of Lot, in its entirety, was an epic of twists of fate guided by a higher will. His initial choice of wealth, the siege of malice, the angelic intervention, the desperate flight, and the tragic loss of his wife all fit into a narrative of trial and redemption. Lot was an instrument of the manifestation of justice, an ordinary man elevated by obedience at a crucial moment. His legacy, though complex, was one of faithfulness. The account evoked reverence, indignation at the injustice suffered, and satisfaction at the ultimate victory of faith over skepticism and sin, fulfilling the purpose of elevating the moral of the story to a chronicle of undeniable divine intervention. Lot's descent from the mountain after a time of seclusion and mourning was not a return to his former life, but the beginning of a new journey indelibly marked by trial. He no longer sought the opulence of the cities, but the humility of shepherding in less coveted regions, a transformed man who exchanged material ambition for peace of mind. His life was a practical lesson on the futility of earthly possessions and the eternity of judgment. The contrast between the Lot who lived in Sodom, rich and tormented, and the Lot who shepherded on the mountain, poor in possessions but rich in faith and testimony, was evidence of a profound spiritual transformation, a conversion not through preaching, but through fire. The relationship with his uncle Abraham, the patriarch of faith, became the axis of his new life. Abraham, who had interceded for him, received him not with censure for his past choice, but with the embrace of the covenant. The meeting of the two men, one coming from destruction and the other from promise, sealed the continuity of faith. Lot was the link between judgment and grace, a testimony to Abraham and his descendants that the Eternal fulfills what he promises, whether in condemnation or salvation. Lot's protection was not isolated, but an integral part of God's greater design for Abraham, underscoring the role of faith and intercession in the history of redemption. The nations of Moab and Ammon, born from a decision made in the panic of extinction, grew and became a constant reminder of human frailty in moments of extreme trauma. Although they were descendants of the righteous Lot, the shadow of their origin, a disobedience to moral law born of necessity, would haunt them in their destiny. The narrator, with his long-range vision, reveals that this origin would influence the hostility of these nations towards Israel in the future, showing that divine judgment and human consequences intertwine in the onward formation of peoples. Lot's legacy was therefore a cautionary tale. Salvation is individual, but family choices have a generational impact. The story of Lot became an epic chronicle of redemption, where the drama of trial was resolved in the satisfaction of justice. The indignation the reader felt at the injustice suffered by the righteous man in Sodom was replaced by the shock of destruction and finally by reverence for God's faithfulness. The triumph of faith was his own life, spared when the lives of millions were taken. His journey from corrupt prosperity to saved humility was a mirror of the spiritual transformation that the Eternal One desired in every man, the abandonment of worldly attachment and the fixing of gaze on the higher promise. The majesty of divine intervention was the central theme, elevating the narrative to an ancient saga of faith. The memory of the pillar of salt, erected as a warning beacon on the shore of the Dead Sea, endured for centuries. It was not merely a statue, but a geological sermon on the price of hesitation and incomplete detachment. Travelers who saw it felt the weight of Lot's wife's fatal choice, a soul that, though redeemed by the body, was lost by the heart. This monument to disobedience was the bitter counterpoint to Lot's triumph, reminding everyone that redemption is a path that demands total renunciation of the condemned past. The narrator uses this image to deepen the drama, contrasting Lot's saved life with the perpetuation of his wife's doubt. The fate of the cities, transformed into a pit of bitumen and sulfur, was the inevitable fulfillment of the prophecy that the Eternal had whispered to Abraham. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not an act of blind fury, but the manifestation of a justice that demands righteousness and does not tolerate unbridled iniquity. The before and after were the most vivid contrast. The beauty of the plain, the opulence of the buildings, the arrogance of the inhabitants, all reduced to ashes and smoke, a testament to the power that disarms human pride. The final triumph was the reaffirmation that moral chaos cannot last forever in the face of divine order. Lot's life, in his final years, was marked by a profound quietude, a contrast to the tumult of his youth in Sodom. He became a patriarch who taught his descendants, Moab and Ammon, the lesson of fire and salvation. Though he was not always heard, his voice carried the weight of history, the solemnity of one who saw the world end and begin again. He spoke of implacable justice and selective mercy, of the covenant that saves the righteous even amidst universal catastrophe. His testimony was the foundation of the prophetic legacy, an echo of the Eternal's voice demanding obedience and fear. The epic of Lot was not a tale of perfection, but of perseverance. He was the man who erred by drawing near to evil, but who, at the moment of judgment, found the strength to obey. His story proved that faith is tested not only in prosperity, but especially in adversity, and that divine intervention is the ultimate seal of faithfulness. The narrative, constructed to inspire reverence, reached its climax in the satisfaction of seeing the righteous man, even with losses, rescued and witnessing the power that humbles pride and exalts obedience. Lot's transformation was complete, from the man of Sodom to the survivor of the judgment. The smoke rising from the valley, even after days, was the materialization of holy wrath, tangible proof that the Eternal One does not tolerate iniquity that becomes the norm. Lot could smell the sulfur in the south wind, and this aroma was a constant reminder of the need for purification and vigilance. His simple and austere house on the mountain was a refuge of faith, an architectural contrast to the opulent and corrupt palaces of Sodom. He exchanged luxury for the security of his soul, an exchange that the narrator exalts as the greatest triumph, the victory over the material attachment that had almost cost him his life. The shock experienced by the antagonists, the Sodomites, upon realizing the reality of their condemnation was a moment of profound drama. Their malice transformed into hysteria, and their skepticism into a belated recognition of the power descending upon them. The narrator reveals that the last thought of many was one of futile repentance, the terror of facing the consequences of their choices. The description of this final moment where pride is crushed serves to underscore divine justice. Lot's triumph was the direct opposite. His faith, previously hidden, manifested itself in his flight, while their arrogance manifested itself in their destruction. The descendants of Lot, the nations of Moab and Ammon, became the living link between the past of Sodom and the future of the covenant. They were the fruit of an extreme trial, born under the shadow of catastrophe. The Eternal, in his sovereignty, did not extinguish Lot's lineage but preserved it, fulfilling the promise to Abraham. However, the origin of its foundation, marked by despair and transgression, would be a historical burden. The account, in addressing this complexity, avoids superficiality, showing that the divine design manifests itself in all its depth, embracing human frailty and its consequences. The story of Lot, the survivor of the fire, was a tale of justice that elevated the moral of the story to a sacred epic. The contrast between life before and after the ordeal was the focal point, the transition from a hesitant man to a man of resolute obedience. The ultimate triumph was the inevitable fulfillment of the promise of protection, the manifestation that God's covenant is the only shield against judgment. The account was dramatic and captivating, forcing the reader to visualize the turning point of fate and to feel the majesty of divine intervention, ensuring reverence, indignation, and satisfaction at the victory of faith. Lot's solitude on the mountain was his penance and purification. Far from the corrupting noise of Sodom, he could hear the silence of the eternal, a silence that spoke louder than all the clamor of the city. There he understood that true wealth was not in the fertile fields of the valley, but in a clear conscience and communion with the invisible. His physical transformation was evident in his countenance, marked by the elements but illuminated by peace. The before, the man of worldly possessions and concerns, had been consumed by fire, and the after was a man of faith and fear, a survivor who carried the story of the judgment in every wrinkle of his skin. Lot's legacy, despite its complexity, was that faith, even when imperfect, attracts mercy. The Eternal had other plans for him, plans that transcended the destruction of Sodom. He was saved not by his merits, but by Abraham's intercession and his obedience at the crucial moment. This was the revelation of divine purpose, to use human frailty to manifest his faithfulness. The Chronicle of Lot was, therefore, a narrative of redemption that inspired spiritual connection, showing that God's covenant reaches those who strive, even imperfectly, to walk the path of righteousness. The terror of that night, where angels blinded the mob and fire fell from the sky, became the foundation of faith for Lot's posterity. The story was not told to glorify destruction, but to glorify deliverance, the protection granted amidst annihilation. The pillar of salt, however tragic, was the visible testimony of the consequence of disobedience and attachment, a lesson Lot never tired of repeating. The account was an epic tale of triumph over adversity, where adversity was sin itself and victory was salvation. The satisfaction of the victory of faith in Lot's case was not noisy, but solemn. It was the peace that follows the storm, the certainty that justice had prevailed. He had seen malice punished and obedience rewarded, and this vision was his greatest treasure. The epic of Lot, the man who escaped earthly hell, fulfilled its role of inspiring reverence and faithfulness, elevating the narrative to an ancient chronicle of divine intervention, where man's destiny is shaped by his faith and the promises of the eternal. Lot's secluded life, far from the tumult of the cities, was proof of his radical transformation. He had understood that the trial was not merely an event to be overcome, but a school of humility and dependence. The luxury of Sodom had become a mirage, and his new reality, austere but secure, was the true triumph. The narrator uses the contrast of before and after to show that true blessing lay not in abundance, but in the absence of sin and the presence of the fear of God. Lot's prophetic legacy lay in his ability to tell the story vividly and solemnly. He did not dwell on irrelevant details, but focused on the acts of spiritual transformation, the trial, the test of faith, the revelation of divine purpose, the covenant of protection, and the triumph. His narrative was a historical chronicle, an epic tale of redemption that extolled the higher will and the inevitability of the fulfillment of the promise. The story of Lot, the patriarch who saw the world consumed and was saved by the hand of angels, was a beacon of warning and inspiration for all generations. His account was not superficial. He delved into the atmosphere of trial and the chronological timeline of overcoming, filling the context with the emotion of fear, pain, and finally, gratitude. The reader was invited to visualize the turning point of destiny and to feel the force of divine justice. Divine justice was undeniably manifested in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the salvation of Lot was proof of his selective mercy. The account evoked indignation at the injustice suffered and satisfaction at the ultimate victory of faith. Lot was the archetype of the righteous person who struggles to remain upright in a corrupt environment, and his story was an epic of rewarded faithfulness, elevating the moral of the story to an eternal truth. At the end of his journey, Lot could look at the Dead Sea, where cities once flourished, and understand the meaning of his flight. He had lost possessions, wife, and sons-in-law, but he had gained life and the certainty of the covenant. His transformation was proof that faith, even amidst pain and loss, is the only path to triumph. The narrator concludes the chronicle with the solemnity of one who has witnessed a cosmic event of judgment and redemption. Lot's legacy, passed down to his descendants, was the story of the supremacy of God's will over human arrogance. His life was an epic tale of redemption, where trials served to purify the soul, and faith was the shield against the fire. The ultimate triumph was his peace, his security, and his inheritance, a living testament to the faithfulness of the Eternal, who separates the righteous from the wicked and fulfills his word with majesty and undeniable power. Do you want more Bible stories filled with faith, teachings, and heartwarming moments? Subscribe and turn on notifications to follow us with each new story.